All right, everyone, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you so much for being here today. Super excited to talk some about course mapping. We've focused on course objectives and the backward design concept of how to map out your courses for fall. And so we have Dawn and Katie here to share their expertise on course mapping. And so I will turn it over to them. Thank you so much for being here.
Morning, everyone. My name is Don Saucier. I'm a professor of psychological sciences, and I'm also the faculty associate director for the Teaching and Learning Center here at K-State. And I am really thrilled to talk to you about course mapping. I think this is a really exciting topic, and I'm very excited to be joined by Katie Linder.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Linder, the Executive Director for Program Development with Global Campus, and course mapping happens to be one of my favorite topics when it comes to course design, so I'm also really excited to be here with you today.
Okay, so let's start out telling you what course mapping is. Course mapping is a really cool thing in that it provides this guided tour for your course. It gives the place where everything is. I know that especially when I'm thinking about a new course and I'm trying to figure out where everything goes, it can be very daunting. And what a course map does, it lets me make that plan. And I treat this as an intellectual puzzle. I have all of the things that I need to find out where they fit and how they transition and how they scaffold. And a course map allows me to create the answer to that puzzle. And it's important to understand that that answer may change as circumstances change, as things are taking a little bit longer than I expect them to take in terms of my teaching it and my students effectively learning it. That plan may need to be flexible, need to change. But at the onset to my course, this course map provides for me a support system that I know that everything's going to fit.
All right, so next we're going to talk a little bit about some benefits and also some challenges of course mapping, and I'm going to tackle the benefits first. First of all, course really allows you to focus on coverage within your course and making sure that not only are you covering things like the content that you want to make sure is covered throughout the term, but also that things like your learning objectives show up where you want them to show up and that they're in your course in kind of a purposeful way. You also can use a course map to make sure that you have a mix of different pedagogical strategies throughout the term and things aren't getting kind of stale or too repeated as you meet with your students. And also you can check to make sure that everything you want to assess is being assessed. So you can kind of cross-check that all of your learning objectives are showing up where you want them to and that they're being assessed throughout the term. Course mapping also allows for something called constructive alignment, which basically means that you're kind of connecting all the different parts of your course in a way that feels meaningful, purposeful, and intentional, and that you have learning objectives that get tied specifically to assessments, and that you know everything is kind of cross-checked, and it's almost like a check and balance to make sure that everything is showing up that you want to show up or had intended to show up over the course of a term. A couple other benefits of course mapping include sequencing, which is allowing you to kind of think about the ordering of your content from a few different angles to make sure that you're ordering it in a way that makes the most sense for you, but also for your students, and kind of recognizing that your students are coming course as novices, most likely, and you're organizing the course from an expert perspective. So there are actually a number of different ways that you could organize the content that would all work really well. But this course mapping exercise can kind of allow you to try on different ways of organization to make sure that you're sequencing things in the ways that you want. Now, this can also lead to the scaffolding of learning objectives, which basically means that you would decide some learning objectives need to come before others, and some are maybe dependent on others before they would show up in the course. And again, you can kind of play with different models for this to see how it might work. And then lastly, a course map really becomes kind of a support system for you throughout the term. So you can refer to out throughout the term as the course is being offered. It can help you, I think, to make changes if you need to throughout the term. And I know all of us are kind of thinking about this for the fall. If we do have to shift to a remote offering or something along those lines, how are we going to make that shift in a way that feels intentional, not stressful? And a course map can really help you to do that because you have a little bit of a plan for the term and it is malleable. It's something that you can kind of tweak. You can look at what you had planned and kind of move things around from week to week if you need to. You can add things in, you can remove things. It gives you a little bit of flexibility in that planning process. And I think for a lot of people, that helps people feel more comfortable and really ready to go into a term, that you're not kind of planning on a week to week basis, but that you've looked at the entire term, you've made some decisions about what is going to go where. And it's not that it's set in stone, but that you do have kind of a rough idea of what the term is going to look like. Now, for some people, this also creates a good level of confidence when you have a new prep, whether that new prep is in terms of content, a course that you've never taught before, or if it's in terms of modality. If you're teaching blended for the first time or online for the first time, a new prep is something that can be kind of stressful because we're just not sure what exactly is going to happen. But having a bit of a map in front of you where you have a sense of what this can look like, I think can kind of lower the stress in that area. So Dawn is going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of course mapping, and then we're going to go over each of the elements of a course map in detail, and you'll get to see some examples so you can really know what we're talking about here.
So as Katie said, course maps are wonderful because they allow you to scaffold the content. You get to put things in order so that they're going to make sense when you're teaching. But especially if you haven't taught this course before, you haven't done a course map before, it doesn't mean it's going to be an easy process to find out where everything goes. That intellectual puzzle might not have an answer that so immediately presents itself. So some of the things that I recommend in kind of addressing these challenges is paying attention to the transitions among your topics. Sometimes it's really, really easy. If you're in a promotion class, you kind of say, okay, you've got to learn to write the beginning of a paper before the middle of the paper. That might be really easy to kind of see where things go. And it might be easy to transition from the beginning of a paper to the middle of the paper. But when you teach a survey course of an entire discipline, it might be harder to see where those subjects really build onto each other. So one of the things that's really challenging sometimes is trying to think about how you can transition from one topic to another without doing what Monty Python used to do in some of their comedy skits, that and now for something completely different. We don't want to always do that. We want to be able to build and create connections among our materials. Another challenge is that we're making decisions before we've started the course. And what this means is that we don't always know what our students are going to need. We don't know what their skill sets and their knowledge bases are going to be when they come in that class. We won't know potentially how long it's going to take for us to teach something or for them to learn something. So without that information, this really becomes a plan, not set in stone, because we do have to understand that we're anticipating, we're projecting what we think is going to be the amount of time we need for something, and that may not be an accurate prediction. So nothing is going to be set in stone, and these plans need to change as we promote our student learning throughout that course. Another thing, especially when I'm teaching a new course, I'm making choices about something that I don't know what I'm going to be doing yet. Sometimes in a new course, and maybe I'm being too honest about this, I'll say in week 7, I'm going to talk about this subject, and I really don't know what that means. I really don't know what I'm going to be teaching. I don't know how long it's going to take to teach that. And then when I get to week 7, I say, oh no, this is a 3-week endeavor. So what needs to happen sometimes is we have to make these choices for our mapping, but we may have to understand that when we get there, to realistically allow our students to succeed, we may have to adjust. And one of the things is it makes me feel stressed to adjust, but it's something that I accept for course mapping.
Okay, so we wanted to also walk you through each of the different elements of a course map. So you would start with just the week that you're map out, and this is going to be on a kind of matrix or table. So your weeks are going to run down the side as like rows in your table, and then each of these other areas are going to be across the top in your columns. And again, we'll show you some examples in just a few minutes. So after you have your weeks laid out, you're probably going to have a topic or maybe more than one that you're planning to cover for each of those weeks. So you would put that in your course map. And then you're also going to have some learning objectives. And what we mean by that, which we talked about earlier in the Online and Blended Course Design Institute, is that there are things that students should be able to do to be able to demonstrate their learning after they've completed the course or after they've completed a particular module. And these are often phrased with specific verbs that can be measured and observed. So these learning objectives are going to be embedded within your course map so that you can kind of see when you want certain things to be covered. Then you're going to have some kind of pedagogical choices to make within your course. And each week you might have what we're calling direct instruction, which is activities that are more instructor-led. So this could be things like a lecture video, a demonstration, or activities where your students are really following your lead in terms of taking direction from you with their learning. But you might also have some things that are more guided inquiry. And these are activities where students are taking of the lead on their learning. It could be a small group activity, a student-led research project, something like a digital scavenger hunt, where students are kind of being the agent of their own learning. Now, in all likelihood, you might have weeks where you have both. You have some direct instruction and you have some more student-led activities that are happening in your classroom. The idea in the map is just to try to get a sense of when those things are happening and to see what kind of balance you have between those kinds of activities. Now, it's something to consider is that it's often more common to have more direct instruction in things like first year experience courses, or where you have students who are like really brand new to the material. You might start with more direct instruction in the beginning term. And then for students who are more advanced or as they progress throughout the term, you might shift to more guided inquiry. So on your course map, you could see that happening, that maybe in the beginning weeks, you have more direct instruction. And then as the term goes on, it might shift to more guided inquiry. We also have an area on the course map to talk about social presence. And this is really the areas and the moments in your course where you are trying to connect with your students or to help them to connect with each other. And something like a discussion board where you have them introduce themselves or talk about topics that they're finding that are related to the course and that are really helping them to kind of connect the course material with their lives and then share that with you and each other. These would be examples that focus on social presence. Now, social presence in the in-person classroom is often tied to things like eye contact, calling students by name, the conversations you might have with them before or after class starts about like the movie they watched over the weekend. So in an online classroom or a blended classroom, we might want to be a little bit more intentional about what this looks like. And so that's why we've really included it on that course map to make sure that you're noting it. There's also an area of the course map for assessment and evaluation. And this is where you would include areas of the course or moments in the course where you're asking students to provide evidence that they've demonstrated a particular learning objective or that they've met a particular learning objective. So this could include things like exams or projects or assignments that you've given to your students. And again, you might find on your course map that you don't have something for this every single week, depending on how you're defining assessment and evaluation, or you might have some things that are a little bit more like milestones or check-in points throughout the term, and then more what we call formative assessments that are a little bit more formal, like exams or tests that are happening throughout the term as well. And then the last column that we include on the course map is a place to talk about reflection or metacognitive activities. And this is really where you're helping students to focus own learning process and to try to see what is really working for them when it comes to the effectiveness of their study strategies or the kinds of strategies that they're using within the class to complete assignments or to really demonstrate that they're achieving the learning objectives. So things like journals or discussion board posts or something called assignment wrappers, where you ask students to complete reflective questions as part of an assignment that they turn in. These are all good examples of reflection or metacognitive activities where you're really asking students to focus on their own learning. So as you're thinking about these course map elements, a couple other considerations we want you to think about. One is you might think about asynchronous versus synchronous, and there might be places in your course map where you want to note what is happening with students in real time. That is, if you're meeting with them, for example, in Zoom or in an in-person classroom when it comes to a blended option, or when you're meeting with them asynchronously and there's maybe a little bit more time buffer for them to be like responding to a discussion board or an activity where they are not necessarily doing it in the same real-time environment. And then the other piece, which I kind of mentioned, is that some of us who are kind of completists want to fill in every box in the matrix. And when Don shares an example with you, he's actually going to show you one where lots of boxes are filled in. But when you fill out an entire course map, you may actually find that some boxes are not filled in for every week. And really the idea is to get an overall picture of what's happening in your course over the course of a term. So you're looking kind of a mix across the matrix and across that course map of what you're engaging with your students in terms of their learning, but you're not necessarily trying to fill in every single box. So I think that that can take some of the pressure off if you're working on a course map maybe for the first time, or you're really trying to get as ahead as possible with the course map in terms of filling it in, of course, across multiple weeks. So we also have just some quick guiding questions as you're thinking about your course mapping, and then we'll dive into some examples, and we're also happy to answer questions that you might have as well. So the first question is if your learning objectives should be scaffolded. So I had mentioned this really early on in today's presentation that sometimes you might have learning objectives that need to come first before you can introduce other content or learning objectives. And this is really just helping students to see the building blocks of your content, that there are pieces that they need to learn before they can continue on and learn other pieces, or maybe there's more beginner things and then more advanced things. And this can really help students to kind of wrap their heads around a larger picture of what they're trying to figure out in your course. You can also ask if there are assignments, activities, or assessments that really help students to accomplish a particular learning objective. So really break down each objective and say, what is it that would really offer them an opportunity to practice this or to really feel like they've mastered this particular learning objective. And you can even tie together different classroom activities with assignments so that students, again, really see how those things build on each other. You might also want to ask if you have certain learning objectives that repeat across multiple weeks. And this is really common if you have a lot of practice that students are engaging in, like if you have a couple different research assignments that students do, and you're actually going to see them kind of do multiple drafts of something and revision work over the course of the term, you might see that the learning objectives need to be repeated because they're kind of leveling up their abilities within those areas as you work through multiple weeks of your class. Some other guiding questions to consider is how you can also scaffold assignments to help students develop skills over time. So in addition to scaffolding your learning objectives, you might also want to break larger assignments into smaller pieces. And again, this really helps students to understand what we probably consider to be very tacit knowledge about our disciplines and how things work. And I think, for example, about like literature reviews, you know, these can be very like abstract things that we do when it comes to a research assignment, but really breaking down that process and helping students see the step by step of what they should be doing can really help them to understand where they're struggling or where they have real strengths when it comes to completing an assignment. You also might want to ask if there are any learning objectives that are not being measured in your course assignment. So it should be pretty clear to you if you don't have alignment between learning objectives and assessments once you do the course map. And that's a good thing because it can help you to understand if you need to add in an assignment, or maybe there's a learning objective that was once, you know, important in this course but is not as important anymore, and you've replaced it with something else. Our courses are really evolving over time, and so we can really think about this as, again, a kind of check and balance to make sure everything that's included should really be there. And then you also want to ask if there's a mix of both instructor-led and student-led experiences in the course. And this really just helps students to have a lot of different ways to engage in their learning. So they're not always being kind of told what to do, but they also have some agency in what they're doing. This can also really lead to them feeling more motivated and have more buy-in in the learning experience as well. And then just a couple more guiding questions before we dive into those examples. Are you providing students with opportunities for assessing if they're achieving the course's learning objectives? And this gets into a little bit of a discussion of universal design for learning as well, are the opportunities that you're providing for students with assessment really a range of possibilities so that they can really show, again, where they're strong, and they can show you different kinds of evidence of what they're learning over time. And then lastly, of course, that social presence piece. Are you creating a strong sense of how students can connect with you and how they can connect with each other? And that really contributes to the overall learning community that you're trying to develop in the course. Now, that learning community can always look different in in-person, blended, and online courses, but it's really important that we build it intentionally. And a course map can really show growing and evolving over time. All right, I'll hand it back over to Don for some examples.
So what we're going to do is we're going to show you part of a course map for my general psychology class. In my general psychology class, for those of you who haven't taken it, and you should have taken it at some point, it's the greatest class ever, but the general psychology class presents the entire field of psychology over 16 weeks, which means that basically we cut the course up into a couple of different topics and we give a little bit of it in the hopes that if they have real interest, they'll take upper level courses in that same area. So we've got quite a lot to cover. So a course map in this class is really, really important so that I can make sure that I'm giving appropriate coverage to things without one topic taking over my entire course when it just doesn't have the opportunity to do that. So I'm going to show you what a little bit of the overall map looks like, and then a little bit more of a deep dive into a week of that course. So we're going to start with the overall map. So what you can see here, and sorry, I just got to move the faces so I can see there we go. So you can see at the top, we have week 1 of my course map. And in week 1, my topic is both course introduction and telling my students what psychology is and helping them understand what the field basically is defined as. So my objectives here in the second box, so as we're moving across from left to right, is my students will interact with course elements in Canvas. One of the things is that especially first-year students, I have a lot of first-year students in my class, is they won't have had much experience with Canvas, if any experience with Canvas before. So it's important that one of my objectives is helping them orient to my class in that learning management system. But also the kind of the content area, my objective here is the students will define psychology and its boundaries as a field. So they'll define it and also be able to say what it isn't. So for my direct instruction, these are the things that I'm going to be doing, as Katie talked about. My students are going to view a welcome video. So they're going to meet me. I want them to know who I am, both as a teacher and as a person. So I'm going to have a short introductory video where I talk about me, my learning outcomes, all of those kind of things, my pedagogical practices, and my intention to promote their success. They'll also view a syllabus overview video where I'll actually go through each element of the syllabus. I'll put the PDF up there and I'll go through the syllabus point by point, letting them know what those things mean and giving them recommendations for how to succeed in my class. They'll also view a video in this direct instruction of me modeling interaction with the Canvas page. I'll show them where they're going to find the modules for each week, how they're going to access the syllabus, those kinds of things so that they'll have some instruction in that. And then finally, they'll start to do some viewing a video of the lecture on the definitions and boundaries of the field of psychology, this mini lecture that I'll give on that. And then each week, I'll have a highlight and cue section with me. And this will be done synchronously. So it'll be kind of like almost like a Zoom session where they come in and I'll provide some highlights of what I think are the most important things for the week, the points that are easiest to confuse, the things that I use to help keep them straight, as well as offer them in real time the opportunity to ask me questions that I can then answer. So that's the stuff that I'm going to be directly instructing. The guided inquiry, my students are going to use those Canvas resources to complete a course scavenger hunt. So they're going to demonstrate the skills that they've learned by finding things like when is exam 1, when is the third paper due, those kinds of things. And students will use their online textbook to answer homework questions on psychological schools of thought. And this won't necessarily be a huge assignment, but to be able to show that they can first access the textbook and that they can go in and use it as a way to find information that they will want. They will also participate on a discussion board about psychology being a science. At this point, I've defined it as a science, but I haven't really told them what that means. So I'll get them to ask, well, do you agree that psychology is a science? Why or why not? So they'll get to interact with that question and with each other. For my social presence elements, my students are going to describe themselves using 6-word self-essays on the course discussion board. I love 6-word essays. I use them all the time. And this is their first introduction to that learning method that I use in my class. So in 6 words, they've got to boil down themselves into an essence. And now they introduce themselves in a way that they can start to get some community building with me and with each other. But they're also introduced, Katie talked about scaffolding assignments, they're introduced in a very safe and easy way what that assignment will be like as we continue throughout the course. In the second week, they might do 6 words on what psychology is, but for now they're doing 6 words on themselves. They will also attend and contribute questions in that highlights and questions session with me session that I talked about in the directed instruction section. In terms of assessment and evaluation, I have a couple of pieces on here. The first is they'll do a first day survey where they'll assess their motivations for taking their course and also their preconceptions about psychology. One of the big things in my teaching philosophy is I think that everything comes from intrinsic motivation. Motivation because you want to, not because you have to. If you have to, if you're doing it for an external reason, that's extrinsic motivation. We find psychologically that's not as good and that's not as sustainable. So I want to know, are they here for intrinsic reasons or extrinsic reasons? And I want to be able to talk about that. I also am going to look at those course scavenger hunt things. Are they accessing the course page well? Are they able to access the textbook? And I'll be able to see how well they did that homework completion about their knowledge of the schools of thought and psychology. Now, in terms of that metacognitive piece, that reflection piece about how they're engaging critically with the information, on that first day survey, they'll be thinking about their motivations, which I've had a lot of students tell me they haven't really considered those often before. Well, now we can get them to consider those. The self-essays will get them to define themselves for their essential qualities. And when we talk about psychology and self-concept, this is going to provide a foundation for that later discussion. And then for the science discussion board, they're now considering what they think a science is and whether psychology fits that definition, which is going to be a big part of week 2. So I've now scaffolded into my second week. In the second week, I won't go into quite as much detail of every single element. I'll give you some broader strokes, but you'll kind of see how this creates a to-do list for me each week. So in the second week, now we're talking about the components of the scientific method. This is one of our objectives. They're going to listen to find psychological research methods. They're going to talk about different research designs. They're going to talk about different terms like hypotheses and how we test them. For the direct instruction, I'm going to have some more lecture modules. I'm going to try to keep these short, try to keep these focused, try to keep these directed. The first of these will be the 3 components of the scientific method. Another will be types of variables, comparing independent to dependent, correlational to experimental research designs, those kinds of things. We'll talk about hypotheses versus theories versus operational definitions. We'll talk about causality and experimentation and how it is that we can say that a variable caused another one versus when we can only say that they're related. And again, the highlights and questions session with me, where I'll be able to give them some guidance on that and to hear the questions that they have and provide some answers. For guided inquiry, they're going to read a short journal article and identify those research features they learned about in those modules. So they'll identify the independent variable, the dependent variable, the research design, whether or not it was a correlational study, an experimental study, those kinds of things. For social presence, now I'm introducing another assignment that they'll use a lot throughout the semester, is this scary questions assignment, where they're going to say, what question would you like me not to ask you about research methods and why? And this is a really safe way for them to indicate the difficult and confusing topics that I can now provide some more guidance about. They'll provide feedback to each other on the research proposal worksheets, because it was a very important part of the scientific process. And again, they'll be attending that highlight and question section with me. In terms of assessment, we'll have a research article worksheet that I had mentioned in that guided inquiry section. And I'll have a research proposal worksheet to assess their ability to apply the content to actually create research questions that lead to hypotheses and operational definitions. So this will be kind of a more difficult kind of assignment. They're going to take everything they've learned and use it to create. So this will be those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And then for that metacognitive reflection piece, they've got to go through, they've got to evaluate, and they've got to decide, what don't I want him to ask because it scares me, to identify and be self-aware of their learning and the limitations of that learning so I can extend that learning through my interactions with them. So this is and this would continue. I'd have one of these for each week. So what we see now is a breakdown, my to-do list for each week as I go through. So for week 1, this tells me what I've got on my plate to get ready to teach. So for my learning objectives, repeated from the overall course map, my interacting with the elements in Canvas, as well as them defining psychology and the boundaries as a field. Now we see this matrix, this 2x2 matrix over here, where I have 4 different areas for me to kind of organize the information to help me teach. So in the online module content, these are modules that I have to be ready for. So I'm going to create the welcome and syllabus videos. I'm going to create the Canvas page video. I've created the psychology as a field video. And I've got to organize that highlight and question section. I've got to get myself ready for those things. For the synchronous assessments, these are things that we're going to be doing, in real time with each other. I have an informal learning check on those highlights and questions. So I'll be giving them highlights, but I'll also be able to see from, and I'll use the chat for this feature, as well as their verbal responses if they're comfortable. I'll be able to get those questions and identify where those pockets of confusion are, where I can better extend their learning. For the out-of-class activity, I'm going to be asking them to do the course scavenger hunt, the schools of thought homework question, and participate on that discussion board about whether or not they think psychology is a science and why. And then the asynchronous assessments, they'll do that first day survey at their convenience, do the course syllabus scavenger hunt at their convenience, and they'll do the schools of thought homework questions at their convenience. So I've got this nice to-do list laid out for me about what it is that I have to be ready for. Now, I also have this notes section for me, and this provides me some guidance for getting ready for the week. So the first of those is my recollection of having taught this course before, is the big question students often have had is psychology really a science? And how are the schools of thought within psychology really different? So how are social and developmental, for instance, how are those perspectives different in defining human behavior? So these are things that I know to emphasize when I'm getting ready for those video modules, as well as getting myself ready for in those highlight and question sessions that they'll have with me. And then I can get ahead of those questions. I can use the chat and the polling during those sessions so that I'm not caught unaware of confusions that I've had come up later. So I really like this notes section as kind of just reminders for me about this is what you really want to get ready for, even if it doesn't show up easily in an assignment or in a video module that I've created. Now, one of the things that I'll point out is, and we said this a couple of times, is this is a plan. I might see that this plan in week 1 went amazingly, but then realize that I can't do all of those video modules with that much content in week 2. And maybe I have to change that up. Maybe I find out that one of those assignments that I expect not to take very long takes a really long time. And then I have to adapt in that way. So this is a flexible plan, but it is not written in stone. So what you've seen now is we've outlined what we think course mapping is. We've outlined those benefits and those challenges that we've anticipated. We've provided some guiding questions and we've given you some models. And now what would be really helpful for us is to know what questions do you have so that you can apply this to teach well.
Please feel free to type into the chat box or just go ahead and unmute yourself. We're kind of a small group today, so I'm sure we can handle it that way as well.
Well, I'll jump in here. I'm a little let me start out by saying I'm an adjunct professor, so I have another profession that I do, and I teach one course, but it's a survey course with a great deal of material in it, and I'm a little intimidated about. It's one thing to do this in the classroom, and this will be my 4th time teaching the course, because I can gauge in real time, but this, kind of where the students seem to be going, but trying to bounce between the remote learning seems to just cut that off for me. And I'm trying to figure out, this is very helpful. I feel like I do a lot of this intuitively, but using the challenges of remote teaching, how do you personally assess whether you're any of the mud sticking to the wall here? I found that very difficult last spring, when we shifted gears and went to remote. I felt like I was talking to my computer screen as much as anything. And but so taking this mapping function with a lot of material, I think mine's media law, and so I think it's more of a survey course. But how do you get your arms around that? It's a simple thing, I guess. Simple question.
I guess I'll start out by saying that I'd never done anything remote or online until this pandemic hit. I love face-to-face teaching. I love being in the class with my students, and I was really nervous that I was going to hate it, and I didn't. It was kind of cool. But one of the things that I really tried to focus on was to having lots of points of contact with my students. So that social presence piece for me was really important. I wasn't willing to give up that connection with my students. So one of the things that I immediately did in my classes is I had these weekly sessions where they could ask me questions. And I really, really liked that. I also took all of my big assignments and turned them into multiple small assignments, as Katie kind of talked about when we kind of divvy those up. And it able to provide me more informal learning checks and more short formal learning checks on a lot of information. So I wasn't having them write 10-page papers. I was having them write me 2 questions. And it was the 2 questions that they didn't want me to ask, right? Those scary questions kind of thing. And that helped me to figure out what mud wasn't sticking to the walls as you kind of had it. I also had my students write brief summaries of the most important things they learned each week. And these didn't take any time for us to grade. It was just, a very short paragraph. We could tell very quickly what they were getting, what they weren't getting. And it was really clear if they weren't giving me back the main points that we had for the week. One of the things that I did is I increased the points of contact, but I reduced the stakes of all of that contact. And I found that for me, that works pretty well. But anytime I teach a course, I have much more ambitious kind of goals for that course than ends up happening. I probably plan about 35-week courses for my 16-week course. The course map that I've just shown you probably get truncated before the semester starts, as I'm saying, that's probably not all going to happen. But I like to think about all of my options in mapping. And then if I cross a couple out, that's okay. But I would much rather be over-prepared than under-prepared when I start a semester.
In me trying to get ready for the fall, and comparing the way the course used to be structured, I am finding myself chunking much more. than I ever thought, and then trying to figure out how to do that. But I guess I like these suggestions about I have a participation grade points that I put in toward the grade, and I think dividing that up with these summaries of what you've learned and other engagement kind of things I've been looking at. I'm just looking for ideas about how to fill that in. So I appreciate that.
Sure. And one of the things I'll say is that every assignment you give is going to come back to you. You know, this is kind of one of those rules of teaching. And I tried to keep everything really short. So actually the entire assignment that I gave is they had to tell me the 3 most important things they learned each week, the 1 most surprising thing, and then the 1 scary question. I think that's exactly what I had done in my advanced social class this last semester. And those are really cool to read. And I really like kind of going through that and seeing what hit. And it didn't take really any time for me to deal with that. Everyone was giving me about half a page of information. And this was a course of about 30 students. So it really provided me a nice way to see what it is. The other point you mentioned about chunking is, as I mentioned, I use 6-word essays in my class, right? Getting at the essence. What I'm doing now is I'm having to do that in my classes. What is really essential for performing the connections that need to grow in my class? So I'm spending less time on all of the stuff that is more elaboration, and more time on what is directly relevant for them understanding the objectives of my class.
I really like the examples you gave, Dawn, and some of the ones in the earlier part of the presentation, because I think, to Dan's point, sometimes I think we assume too much, that we kind of know in real time whether students are getting it or not just by watching and observing. And I've often had students who in the class time are like, yep, I get it. They're nodding along. They're like showing kind of that active listening. But then they go home and they're like, I don't understand this at all. I thought I did, but now that I'm in the homework, I really don't get it. And so building in all these different checks and the explicit asking of students of what is confusing for you right now, really important, because I think sometimes they also just kind of learn to nod along, and they aren't always being explicit with us about what is kind of confusing for them. So I think that it's a helpful reminder that even in person, we need to be asking these questions and being careful that we're not assuming too much about what we can observe in terms of what they're learning over time.
I have a question that I know won't have a specific answer, but I'm looking for just a ballpark. How much time do you think we would need to invest to develop this? There's no way I can do it before the fall semester, obviously. But if I were to pick one class, I'm thinking, over Christmas break. Or do you think you need 3 months, 6 months to really map it out?
I actually think you can do it in quite a bit less time. It depends on if you've taught the course before. So if you've taught the course before, or if you're even just experienced with teaching to some degree, you're going to have ideas of kind of what you think should happen. Worst case scenario, you could actually fill in a course map during the term and be like documenting what you're doing over time, and then kind of checking with yourself about how that feels and if that feels good. But I would say, even if you could set aside a day and see how far you could get with kind of, if you have your syllabus, you've got your learning objectives, you have a sense of kind of what you're thinking, maybe you have the readings, if you've designed your syllabus, it has a portion of that course map in it in the course schedule. So it may take less time than you think to kind of get ideas down, but I do think it's helpful if you can set aside a couple of hours to really let yourself get into it and try to move the pieces around. I've also seen people do this really successfully with like Post-it notes, like taking Post-its and building like a bigger matrix, like on a whiteboard or a wall, where they can literally like take things down and move them around and like see where it's fit. You could easily do that digitally as well and kind of work within the matrix. But I think sometimes it's very tactile for people to kind of be able to use Post-its or something like that. So I wouldn't think about it in terms of months or weeks. I would think about it in more like hours or days that you'd be able to do an activity like this.
When I like the idea of maybe as I go along this semester, because this is going to be, a little different anyway. And I have taught the same courses for 10 years now, and they've changed in different ways. So I'm just curious now to look at the bigger picture, because I've taught them so often that I don't think so much about the bigger picture anymore because in the back of my mind, I know what's out there.
Right, exactly. And it's kind of a different angle to approach, and it brings some clarity to all kinds of areas of like, oh, so that's why that doesn't ever work. You know, like maybe I need to swap those learning objectives. And I think about a course that I taught for a long time, and there was this really hard concept that I kind of until the end, and I like built up to it over time. And actually what I realized after a couple times teaching the course is I needed to introduce that concept in like the second week so that we could be unpacking it throughout the term rather than like waiting and then giving it to them at the end. That's a really different course structure. But the mapping really helped me to understand that it was helpful to like put it in front of them so that they could wrestle with it. And then we could like approach it from all these different angles rather than trying to like hide the cookie and then they got it at the end. So I think that that's, you know, there's a lot of benefits to really pulling back and trying to see it from a bigger picture because it can really shift actually what you do.
I absolutely agree with that. And I'm going to address some of what Katie said, as well as a question that Kelly Breaks just asked in the chat about what if you're starting from scratch and haven't taught the course before? One of the things, anytime I'm approaching a new prep, is I try to find the big things that we're going to cover, the big topics that we're going to understand, and I list those out. And I only allow myself to go up to 15 because I have about 15 weeks in the semester. I only allow myself up to 15. And sometimes I'm actually happier if there are 5, because then I can divide those into 3 units or 5 units of 3 or something like that. But I find those big things, and then I tell myself, what do students have to learn about each of those things that I've identified as a core concept of my class? Then what happens, I can start to decide, where does it go? How does it scaffold? How does it do? And then what is the big
Oh no, did Don freeze up?
We lost his last thought there. What is the big?
Okay, and
think,
Don's responding to Kelly's question about starting from scratch.
yeah.
Okay, let me dive in, and then if he comes back, we can circle back. So Kelly, I would say that even in a class that's new, we have a lot of experience to draw on with like what's worked well in the past, or what are some things that we just think would work well with a particular learning objective. And sometimes that comes to Bloom's taxonomy of, is this kind of a lower level cognitive thing where we're really just asking them to like memorize something or recall something, or are we asking them to do like analysis or synthesis and it's a higher level form of thinking? So I would say still do the course mapping, but notice where your gaps are. Like that could be the area where you're like, I'm still really trying to figure out week 3 because it's not content that I feel super familiar with, or I'm not sure yet what the activities need to be as they're getting more advanced throughout the course. So it would at least allow you to identify what the gaps are and to be able to do a more targeted meeting, for example, with like Laura or Trina to ask very specific questions about what you're trying to do within the course map. So that would be another way to kind of approach it is look at it to kind of find the gaps in the areas that are feeling a little unsure. The other book, there's a resource I would recommend, and it's a book called Teaching What You Don't Know by Therese Houston. And this is a great book if you're teaching something for the first time or you're feeling like not super confident with the actual content of the course. That's another way to approach it. And people do this all the time where they have a new prep or they have something where they're feeling, 100% rock solid. And so that's another resource to pursue potentially, depending on how you feel about the content. Don, you cut out, but you're back. Do you want to continue with your thoughts?
Sure. Where did I cut out?
We lost you at big.
All right, so I'll try to recreate it. So I try to find the big things that connect all of the pieces of my course. So for instance, when I think about psychology is the study of why people do what they do. And I try to come up with the answers to that question. And I came up with 2 real human truths. And this goes across a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different research. The first is people are lazy. And the second is they want to feel good. So if you want people to work, you got to make them feel good, right? So it's these kind of things. And these 2 human truths explain a lot of psychological theories and research. So what happens is as we go through the various perspectives, the students always see that connection. They always come back to this explanation of human behavior, coming back to these human truths. And there are exceptions to those truths when we talk about why those are exceptions. So what I really try to do is try to find the big ideas that connect the big learning pieces in my course. And then I build my course around opportunities to express that again and again so my students learn it very, very broadly. And I see in the chat that Kelly's saying, well, I don't know what my objectives and my content are. Well, I didn't the first time I taught the course either. It's one of those things where the first time I taught the course, I said, all right, well, I've got to cover development, and I've got to cover social, and I've got to cover brain and behavior. And the second time, and I kept really good notes for myself, I said, hey, I need to switch the order of a couple of these. Hey, I need to introduce this topic earlier. I need to save this a little bit for later. I need to go into a little more detail about this component here. And it's that degree of notes makes that second prep so much better than the first. And I'm being as honest as I can about this. The first prep is my least favorite time teaching a course. It's because I always feel behind, I always feel unprepared, and I always feel surprised by the material. And I'm just not good enough that I can come up with 16 weeks of knowledge and content before it starts. The course map helps me with this, but it doesn't provide me with a set in stone plan that I'm going to take with me to the second semester. So I struggle with my objectives and contents first, but I do a really, I think, thorough job understanding my prediction is not going to be completely accurate. And then I try not to get down on myself if my prediction wasn't accurate, because I understand this is part of the developmental process in teaching. And you know, I had a professor once in graduate school, he said, if I ever get this right, I'll retire. See you next semester. And this is one of the things that I remind myself of as I go through. I haven't gotten this right, but I've got time.
Kelly,
I like that
another
point too,
thought.
Don.
Oh,
Go ahead. I think it's just important to note that you, again, completists are going to be like, ooh, I need to do my whole map. Maybe you do the first 3 weeks and that's a good place to start, you know, or maybe you do the first half of the class and that gives you enough to really be confident about where you're headed. And then as you go, you kind of build on a little bit more. So again, don't feel like you need to have the entire term laid out. And if you're doing it as you go, eventually you'll have a completed map. So you can really take the pressure off with this. There's just a lot of benefits to really trying to think a little bit ahead, especially if in the past you've really gone week to week in terms of trying to kind of be very reactive to students. Having just a little bit more planful time can help, especially in a term like this one where there's just a lot of unknown variables. And so if you can kind of get some of this stuff figured out ahead of time, it might make it easier to move things around later on.
I think what helps me too is every course has a vibe and a rhythm. And when I start doing my course maps and get those first couple of weeks done, I start to decide how it is I want to teach this course. Do I want to do the scary questions? Do I want to have the highlight sessions? Do I want to do the 6-word essays? Do I want to have exams? Do I not want to have exams? I make those decisions, and then that creates the structure for a lot of my map. So Katie mentioned kind of taking this half a day. I find I get faster and faster and faster in course mapping. After I've planned the second or third week, the fourth week is a lot easier. And then the 15th week is really easy. Everything else is kind of laid out in front of that. So this is a process where I get much more efficient as I go through. So if you want to go week by week, you might be able to do that because it's going to get more efficient as you go.
So the point I wanted to make was that, you know, Trina and I are here to support you in that. A lot of times it can feel really overwhelming. You know, you've got to create this whole course map. You have to plan out the entire semester and you're used to going week by week. Totally understandable. And while Trina and I are not content experts in your areas, we're really good sounding boards. Right? We can talk through what your your goals are, what those big ideas are and that kind of thing, and help you shape those objectives, get down to the core. So you could go on for, 5-10 minutes on this is what I want, and then we can go, okay, so what I'm hearing is this, and you can say yes or no, and we can tweak it. So if you want to schedule time with one of us to kind of just talk it through, we're absolutely available for that. Any other questions?
So what else is concerning you about doing this?
Again, I'll jump in. The one thing that's causing me the most time consumption is getting the technology right. You know, I mean, when when the university shut down at spring break last year, I had graduate teaching assistants that had always used Canvas, and I'd posted stuff in Canvas, but now I really feel an obligation to be ready that this is all going to be, we're going to be back in the second half of the spring semester pretty quick. And in fact, I even read the provost thing this morning to kind of start preparing us for the idea that something's going to change around the 1st of August. And so trying to learn these tricks of Canvas. I mean, I'm spending a lot of time on YouTube and on the stuff the university provides. And I find the support to be very good. It's just hard to get your arms around it. And then so to make this class work through Canvas and online the way I want it to is pretty daunting, actually. And it's very time consuming. I've kind of dedicated this week and next week to, doing videos and that kind of thing, but I got to figure out how to do it. So that's been my biggest problem, of making the objectives fit the technology, if that makes sense. So.
One of the things that I will say is I am not very tech savvy. I mean, I just kicked off this seconds ago, right? So I mean, there's evidence of this. I do what I'm comfortable with, and I do what I'm comfortable with well and repeatedly. Like I said, every class has a rhythm and a vibe. Your class doesn't necessarily have to be the one that blows them away with all the technological advantages that you're not comfortable with. So do what you're comfortable with to teach well. And if you want to learn more things, there are wonderful resources. The Keep Teaching website that Katie put together, all of the webinars that we have up about Canvas and MediaSite and all of those kind of things, those are available to you. But do what you can realistically do, because doing something that is going to keep you happy and healthy is really important right now. So don't put too much on your own shoulders. I don't put a lot on my own shoulders to be technologically advanced. I get the information out there for my students to learn, and I evaluate their learning fairly. That's what I hold myself to as a standard, and I try to do that really well. But I don't try to do bells and whistles just to do bells and whistles.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that what you're designing now is without the learning community of your students being layered into it. So we don't just kind of hand them a class on a platter and say, here, open up your brain and pour it in, and then you're done. Like, there's learning that gets created when they're together and when they're with you. So really what we're just trying to create is the foundation for that. What is the foundation that gets them talking to each other, or that gets them kind of thinking through the material, or that provides them with examples that is really going to help the material stick for them. But then there's this whole other layer or series of layers that gets built up over the term as that learning community gets activated. So I think that that's another way to think about it, is what are the prompts that you're creating for that learning community to happen? And that can mean, again, just one layer of content and information. And it's like the course skeleton in some ways that they get to fill in with all the things that they're bringing to the classroom in that community. So that's another way to think about it, is it's not all on our shoulders. We're partnering with them to have a learning community, and they will eventually come in and help fill in some of those things that right now might feel a little bit thin, but that's because they're not here yet. They're not engaging with us yet around the materials.
And so I think as well, you're building your course map, and from that you'll create a course schedule so that you're giving the students the picture of what your course will look like throughout the semester. And especially as the semester, there's going to be that asterisk, that star that says, this may change, right? We don't know for sure how this is going to go. And so that's okay. And so maybe you don't have the entire course built within Canvas as of August 17th, right? Maybe you have the first several weeks built out exactly like you want them to be, and you spend those first weeks building the next few weeks and that kind of thing. Of course, we'd love it to all be ready and publish 100% and we're ready to go and don't have to worry about it. But, we're under a time crunch. So it's definitely okay to think about it that way, that you've got your structure, your consistency, so they can see that in the first several weeks, but then you're continuing to build throughout the semester. And so, Dan, I also want to offer again, Trina and my help, if you want to invite us to your course, as a course designer within Canvas, we can get in there and we can do some of that work and assist you, creating a module structure, laying some things out, uploading some stuff for you. Of course, we can't do your lecture. We are not, we are not able to do that, but we can get in there and we can help you with building out some things that it's just so time consuming. So please don't feel like you're burdening us or anything like that. That's what we're here for.
One of the questions we often get, and we've gotten previous times that we presented this material, is how much of a course map do you share with your students? Because we mentioned the course map and that there's also like a syllabus schedule. And in the syllabus schedule, we often share the topic, the reading, maybe even the learning objectives for that week, the different things we're asking students to do. And one of the things I would really emphasize is that the course map is really a tool for you, the instructor. And it is not necessarily meant to share every single detail with your students. It could be overwhelming to them to do that, first of all, but also you probably will have to shift and change things. And so even if you laid everything out and it looked really perfect from day one, something's going to happen, that you're going to have to shift a day here or there, or you're going to choose an activity and move it somewhere else. So that's something to keep in mind, is that this can be really a private document for you or to share with Laura and Trina to really talk through what you're thinking. But the idea is that it is malleable and you are kind of choosing to move things around or adjust things throughout the term. The in your syllabus, although admittedly this term could be more malleable based on what happens, we do want that to be a little bit more solid for students. Like we want to have some consistency there. And if it does need to change, it's usually because of something out of our control. And so the schedule you can have be a little bit more bare bones in terms of just the basics of what they need to know and what a typical schedule in the syllabus would look like. So don't feel like you need to replicate this course map in your syllabus or even hand it out, as a document to your students. It's really just personal for you and your planning.
Anything else? Well, if anyone has any additional questions, Katie and I had our emails at the beginning of the presentation. I'm going to drop mine here in the chat too, if anyone has any questions for later about anything. One of the things that I love about K-State is that we are committed to our collective teaching excellence. We're here for each other to make sure that our students are having the right experiences and our instructors are supported in creating those experiences for them. So if there's anything that I can do moving forward, please reach out. But I really enjoyed having this conversation with you all this morning.
Thank you all so much for being here. We'll get the recording posted if you want to come back to any of this, and we'll keep talking it through. So thank you both, Dawn and Katie, for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good rest of your day.